The cloying scent of Lysol, battling a deeper, more organic decay, was the first thing to clamp down on Victor Harris as he pushed through the chipped, institutional green doors of the Valerius Institute. It wasn't a smell he knew from the grime of back alleys or the stale perfume of forgotten cases. This was a refined rot, a carefully managed putrescence that seemed to cling to the very air molecules, making each breath a conscious effort. His worn trench coat, usually a shield against the city, as lesser indignities felt suddenly flimsy. The reception area, if it could even be called that, was a narrow, dimly lit corridor that stretched away into an oppressive gloom, punctuated by a single buzzing fluorescent tube that stuttered with an almost rhythmic irregularity. The wall, a muted, textured affair, seemed to absorb what little light managed to escape the struggling fixture, leaving shadows to gather in oppressive pools. A scrawny, black cat, all angular bone and wary intelligence, materialized from one such shadow, slinking past Victor, ankles with a silent, almost spectral grace before vanishing behind a desk piled high with ancient, dusty ledgers. It was the only sign of life. Apart from the distant, muffled thudding that occasionally vibrated through the floorboards, a sound that resonated less with construction and more with the measured pulse of a failing heart. Victor ran a hand over his stubbled jaw, the rasp of his skin, a minor comfort in the overwhelming quiet. The air was thick, not just with the chemical, organic battle, but with a subtle, electric hum that suggested machinery was at work, deep within the building. He was here for a Dr. Albright, a name whispered in hushed tones by a desperate widow, a name supposedly synonymous with radical cures, a veritable suiting maker in the shadowed corners of medical innovation. But the place felt less like a haven of healing and more like a mausoleum of forgotten hopes. He squinted at a barely visible plaque beside a closed door, the brass tarnished to an illegible grey. "Room 29, he murmured, the numbers feeling significant and ominous in the stillness. No one appeared. No bell chimed. No automated voice offered guidance. The silence pressed in, a dense physical thing that made Victor ears ache. He moved deeper, his polished shoes scuffing softly on the linoleum. Each step an intrusion. The corridor narrowed, the walls closing in, their textured surface now seeming to writhe in the poor light, like desiccated skin. The thudding grew marginally louder, and with it, a faint, high-pitched whirring, like a precision instrument being pushed to its limits. He passed several identical, unmarked doors, each one a blank slate for the imagination to scrawl its darkest fears upon. The cat reappeared, a low growl rumbling in its chest, its eyes twin pinpricks of green, fixed on something Victor could see at the far end of the hallway. It was an hedgy sort of animal, twitchy and alert, reflecting the very atmosphere of the place. Victor felt a prickle of unease at the back of his neck, a sensation more acute than the usual caution that came with his trade. This wasn't just a dilapidated building. It felt actively unwell, its very structure groaning under some unseen burden. He found an open doorway, spilling a sickly amber light onto the floor. The room beyond was a laboratory, or what passed for one. Glass beakers, some containing liquids that shimmered with unnatural hues, lined steel benches. A pervasive, sweet, metallic tang was stronger here, almost dizzying. On a central table, a complex array of tubes and wires snaked into a single, large, opaque container, its surface slick with condensation. The whirring sound emanated from it, a persistent, mechanical sigh. Victor leaned closer, his reflection wavering in the polished metal, his face gaunt and shadowed. He saw no labels, no identifying marks, only the stark, unsettling machinery. A low groan, almost too faint to register, seemed to ripple from within the container, a sound that twisted something cold and sharp in Victor. A scut. It wasn't too human, not exactly, but it possessed a pathetic, animalistic quality that made him recoil. He heard the cat hiss from the hallway, a raw, guttural sound that spoke of genuine terror. A shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom at the room's far end. Tall, gaunt, and clad in a pristine white lab coat that seemed almost too bright for the sickly light, Dr. Albright emerged. His face was a mask of placid indifference. His eyes, deep, set and unnervingly still, seemed to bore through Victor with an unsettling intensity. A thin smile, more a twitch of the lips than an expression of warmth, played at the corners of his mouth. "Mr. Harris, Albright." His voice was a low drone, perfectly even, devoid of inflection. "We weren't expecting you quite so early." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implication. Albright. His gaze shifted to the opaque container, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his unnervingly steady eyes. The whirring intensified, and with it, that low, unsettling groan, a sound that now seemed to carry a hint of desperate, burgeoning consciousness. Victor felt the blood drain from his face, a cold dread seeping into his bones. Albright took a slow step forward, his shadow stretching towards Victor, swallowing him whole. The chill that ran through Victor wasn't merely from the Institute's pervasive damp. It was the icy touch of a realization, a creeping certainty that Albright's casual pronouncement carried a weight far heavier than its simple phrasing suggested. The doctor's placid face, devoid of any genuine expression, seemed to absorb the sickly amber light, reflecting none of it, leaving his eyes as dark, unreadable pools. Victor felt a sudden constriction in his throat, a dry rasp that made him clear it, a futile attempt to dislodge the growing lump of dread. The cat, meanwhile, had not merely hissed, but had retreated further into the hallway, its slender form pressed against the textured wall, its green eyes, now wide with a frantic, unblinking intensity, still fixed on the opaque container. Its rigid posture spoke volumes, a primal wordless warning that echoed the cold premonition stirring in Victor's own gut. Really, Victor managed, his voice sounding strangely hollow in the room, a stark contrast to Albright's smooth, almost silken tone. Mrs. Finch said to come now. Her husband, Arthur, he has been missing since his last treatment here. Victor watched Albright for any flicker of recognition, any tell, but the doctor remained a statue, carved from indifference. The persistent whirring from the container seemed to swell a low, mechanical growl that vibrated through the steel bench, making the glass beakers on it tremble almost imperceptibly, their unnatural contents shifting with a sickening viscous grace. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through Victor's own hand, a spontaneous reflex against the insidious wrongness of the place. He felt as though the very air here was thin, stretched taut over some abyss, threatening to tear. The metallic tang in the air, previously sweet, now tasted of something sharper, almost acrid, catching at the back of his mouth. Albright's smile, if it could even be dignified with such a name, barely softened the rigid lines of his face. It was less an expression of amusement and more a concession, a brief, almost involuntary distortion. Ah, Mrs. Finch, impatient, I suppose. Arthur is undergoing a rather delicate phase of his recovery. The doctor gestured vaguely towards the pulsating container, a movement so slight it might have been imagined. We strive for complete transformation here, Mr. Harris, a transcendence of the old, the infirm, the failing form. His words were delivered with the unhurried precision of a seasoned surgeon describing a routine procedure utterly devoid of any emotional register. Yet they resonated with an undercurrent of something deeply unsettling, a philosophical coldness that made Victor's skin crawl. The low groan from within the container seemed to respond to Albright's words, a faint, almost yearning sound that was immediately swallowed by the whirring, leaving Victor to question if he had truly heard it at all. He felt a sudden dizziness, as though the floor beneath him had subtly tilted. Victor stepped closer to the container, his gaze drawn by a faint, rhythmic pulsing beneath its slick surface, like something struggling to break free. The condensation on the opaque shell seemed to weep, forming rivulets that snaked down its sides, leaving trails like dried slime. Transformation, Victor repeated, his voice tight. What kind of transformation? Mrs. Finch said her husband was suffering from a degenerative neurological condition, not that he needed to be made into something else. He gestured around the lab, the strange apparatus, the unnatural colors of the liquids, the pervasive, almost suffocating sweetness in the air that now mingled with a faint earthy dampness like freshly turned grave soil. The cat in the hallway let out another low, shuddering growl, a sound that seemed to scrape against the silence, a desperate plea for attention that was ignored by Albright, whose focus remained entirely on Victor. The doctor's composure was absolute, an unyielding wall against Victor's growing alarm. A necessary evolution, Albright stated, stepping between Victor and the container with a movement so fluid and unexpected it made Victor flinch. The doctor's white coat, pristine and starched, seemed to glow in the amber light, an almost phosphorescent beacon in the gloom. The human form is, ultimately, a flawed vessel, prone to decay, to weakness, to a myriad of inherited deficiencies. We merely accelerate the process, guiding it towards a more optimal state. Oh, Bright's eyes, devoid of any warmth, scanned Victor, a clinical appraisal that made Victor feel like a specimen under a microscope. He could feel the doctor's breath on his face, cool and smelling faintly of something sterile, yet beneath that, a hint of that same sweet metallic tang. The thought of Arthur Finch, reduced to an experiment, a subject of this chilling evolution, made Victor's stomach clench. He gripped the worn fabric of his trench coat, his knuckles white against the dark material, a desperate anchor in the swirling unease. The whirring machine, almost as if sensing Victor's apprehension, suddenly surged, its mechanical side deepening into a resonant drone that vibrated through the floorboards, momentarily eclipsing all other sounds. The opaque container seemed to throb in response, the condensation on its surface now actively streaming, as if something within was generating immense heat or cold. Albright watched it with a detached fascination, a silent, almost reverent regard that filled Victor with a profound sense of wrongness. The cat, unable to bear it any longer, let out a piercing yowl, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, and then, with a frantic scramble of claws on linoleum, vanished down the darkened hallway, leaving only the reverberation of its scream in its wake. Victor felt a sudden, desperate urge to follow it, to escape the suffocating presence of Albright and the terrifying implications of his work. "What have you done to him?" Victor demanded, his voice cracking, a desperate challenge against the doctor's unyielding calm. Albright slowly turned his gaze back to Victor, a chillingly serene expression on his face, and for the first time, Victor noticed a faint glistening film on the doctor's lips, a subtle sheen that caught the amber light like something wet and unnatural. Albright's gaze, unblinking and devoid of any discernible warmth, lingered on Victor's face, tracing lines of fear that Victor hadn't known were so transparently etched. The faint sheen on the doctor's lips, reflecting the sickly amber glow, was an unsettling detail, suggesting an intimacy with the Institute's pervasive, sweet metallic tang that Victor found profoundly disturbing. It was a detail that snagged at Victor's frayed nerves, adding a visceral layer to the abstract horror of Albright's pronouncements. The mechanical drone of the container pulsed with an almost predatory rhythm, a counterpoint to the doctor's unnerving stillness, making the air thrum with an oppressive energy that seemed to press in on Victor from all sides. The frantic yowl of the cat still echoed in the recesses of his mind, a shrill testament to the pure, unthinking terror that had seized the animal, and Victor felt a desperate envy for its swift escape. "Done to him, Mr. Harris." Albright's voice, a low, even murmur, seemed to detach itself from his gaunt form, hanging in the air like a cold vapor. "We have merely facilitated Arthur's progression, guided him beyond the limitations of his failing nervous system." The doctor's long, slender fingers, almost translucent in the dim light, drifted towards the opaque container, stopping just short of its slick surface, a gesture of proprietary reverence. He is no longer bound by the frailties of memory, the agonizing degradation of motor function, the relentless erosion of self. He is becoming something more refined, more resilient. The words, delivered with such clinical detachment, painted a grotesque picture in Victor's mind. A canvas of forced evolution, of a man stripped of his humanity in the name of some twisted medical ideal. The sweet, metallic scent intensified, suddenly tasting like stale blood and something else, something cloyingly artificial, like cheap disinfectant trying to mask a deeper, more organic corruption. Victor felt a wave of nausea, a sudden lurch in his stomach that threatened to betray his composure. Resilient. He is a human being, Doctor, not a specimen for your experiments. He took a step back, bumping against a steel cart laden with gleaming instruments, their polished surfaces reflecting distorted slivers of the amber light. A faint clatter of metal against metal, a small, insignificant sound, seemed to reverberate through the oppressive quiet of the laboratory, momentarily startling Albright. But the doctor quickly regained his unyielding composure, his eyes, dark and unreadable, returning to Victor with an unnerving intensity. The low groan from within the container was now clearer. A sustained guttural hum that vibrated through the floor, a sound that Victor's mind, in its frantic search for an explanation, could only associate with immense, muffled suffering or perhaps with a nascent, unfamiliar form of life struggling to articulate itself. "Human being?" Albright countered, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor passing through his gaunt frame, a momentary rupture in his placid facade. "A temporary state, Mr. Harris, a larval stage in the grand scheme. We are merely accelerating the metamorphosis." He extended a hand towards the container again, this time resting his fingertips lightly on its cool, slick surface. The whirring machine seemed to respond, its drone deepening, vibrating through Albright's very bones. Victor watched in horrified fascination as a faint ripple, a subtle undulation, seemed to pass beneath the doctor's skin, beneath the pristine white of his lab coat, a movement that suggested something more than mere blood and muscle beneath the surface. It was a fleeting impression, gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving Victor to question if his own fear was distorting his perception. The cloying sweetness in the air now seemed to coat his tongue, leaving a dry, unpleasant aftertaste. "And what of consent, Doctor?" Victor pressed, forcing his voice to remain steady, despite the tremor in his hands, which he now shoved deep into his coat pockets, attempting to hide their involuntary trembling. Did Arthur Finch consent to be metamorphosed? The idea was ludicrous. Yet the grim reality of the situation, the clinical horror of Albright's words, and the chilling presence of the pulsating container lent it a terrible, undeniable weight. The doctor's face remained a mask, but his eyes, those unnervingly still pools, seemed to deepen to draw Victor into their unreadable depths. The amber light in the room, previously merely sickly, now seemed to possess a deeper, more menacing quality, casting elongated, grotesque shadows that writhed and stretched with every subtle movement of the air. It felt as though the very fabric of reality within this room was thin, stretched taut and threatening to tear. Albright finally turned away from the container, his gaze sweeping over the lab, over the strange apparatus, the unnatural liquids, the silent, gleaming instruments that seemed to wait with a terrible patience. Consent, Mr. Harris, is a construct of the limited mind. When true progress beckons, such niceties become secondary. He paused, his head tilting slightly, as if listening to a sound beyond Victor's hearing, or perhaps to an internal monologue of chilling justification. Arthur's pain, his decline, these were the true atrocities. We have merely replaced them with potential. Albright's lips, still bearing that faint, unnatural sheen, parted slightly, and for a fleeting instant, Victor thought he saw something move within the dark recesses of the doctor's mouth, a flicker of something too quick to identify, yet too disturbing to ignore. The whirring machine surged once more, a sustained, high-pitched whine, and the low groan from the container seemed to rise with it, a sound that was no longer just suffering, but something else, something new and utterly alien, a sound that curdled Victor's blood, the sound emanating from the opaque container, no longer merely a groan of suffering, but a nascent, alien articulation, seemed to tear at the very fabric of the laboratory's oppressive quiet. It was a wet, grinding murmur, punctuated by irregular, percussive thumps against the container's inner surface, as if something immense and uncoordinated was stirring within. Victor felt a cold sweat prickle his scalp, the hair on his arms rising in involuntary revulsion. Albright, meanwhile, watched the pulsating machinery with an unblinking, almost beatific expression. His face bathed in the sickly amber glow that now seemed to intensify around him, throwing his sharp features into stark, unsettling relief. The faint, glistening film on the doctor's lips seemed to shimmer, drawing Victor's gaze with a morbid fascination, a subtle detail that screamed of unspeakable practices and intimate contact with the horrors he supposedly engineered. Potential, Victor finally managed, his voice a strained whisper against the machine's rising drone. His eyes darted from Albright's unnervingly serene face to the throbbing container, then back again, searching for any crack in the doctor's placid facade, any hint of the monstrous ego or the twisted rationale that drove such an enterprise. What kind of potential involves this? He swept a trembling hand across the room, encompassing the unnatural liquids, the gleaming, sterile instruments that now seemed less tools of healing and more implements of a cold, precise torture. The air, thick with its sweet metallic tang, now carried an additional, more pungent odor, something reminiscent of ozone and raw, unsterilized meat, a smell that made Victor's stomach churn with an unbearable revulsion. He felt an inexplicable pressure behind his eyes, a vague, throbbing ache that pulsed in time with the machine. Albright's head tilted again, a slow, deliberate movement that reminded Victor of a predator assessing its prey. The potential for a state beyond organic fragility, Mr. Harris? Imagine a being unburdened by disease, by pain, by the slow, inexorable decay of the flesh, a consciousness freed from the limitations of a crumbling shell. His voice, though still low, and even now carried a subtle, almost hypnotic cadence, a seductive poison that threatened to lull Victor into a horrifying acceptance. Albright's eyes, fixed on Victor, seemed to expand slightly, deepening into bottomless pools of shadow, reflecting nothing but the amber light of the lab. The thumps from within the container grew more forceful, more deliberate, as if whatever resided within was gaining strength, its nascent form struggling against its confines. A thin, spiderweb crack, barely visible, appeared on the container's opaque surface, tracing a jagged path from top to bottom. Victor's breath hitched in his throat. He pointed a shaking finger at the fissure. "What is that? What have you done to Arthur?" The question was less an inquiry and more a desperate accusation ripped from a place of growing panic. He could feel the fine hairs on his arms standing on end, a primal warning system screaming at him to flee. The sweet metallic odor was now almost unbearable, clinging to his clothes, his hair seeping into his very pores. He felt a phantom taste of copper and something else, something slick and viscous, at the back of his mouth. The machine's whine escalated, a high-pitched shriek that seemed to scrape against the inside of Victor's skull, threatening to shatter his fragile composure, to splinter the last vestiges of his hard-boiled resolve. He realized with a chilling certainty that the Institute wasn't merely a place of medical horror. It was a crucible, a breeding ground for something utterly new and profoundly wrong. Albright followed Victor's gaze to the crack, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing at the corners of his lips. There was no alarm in his expression, only a detached, almost scientific curiosity, as if observing a fascinating, anticipated phenomenon. A minor imperfection in the containment field, Mr. Harris. A predictable consequence of rapid growth and burgeoning power. He spoke of it with the casual air of a craftsman discussing a flaw in his material, utterly ignoring the horrifying implications of a sentient, powerful entity attempting to breach its prison. The whirring machine, now a deafening roar, seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the building, making the steel benches shudder and the unnatural liquids in the beakers slosh precariously. The low, grinding murmur from within the container had ceased, replaced by a series of sharp, splintering sounds, like bone snapping or thick glass cracking under immense pressure. A spiderweb of new cracks erupted across the container's surface, spreading with terrifying speed, each new fissure emitting a faint, sickly green luminescence that pulsed in conjunction with the machine's roar. Victor stumbled back, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended mere fear, a primal horror that clawed at the deepest parts of his being. The sweet metallic scent in the air surged, thick and suffocating, mingling now with a new, sharper smell like burnt sugar and something vaguely antiseptic, yet profoundly alien. Albright extended a hand, not to calm Victor, but to touch the glowing, fractured container, his fingertips brushing against the pulsing green light. A low chuckle, a sound utterly devoid of mirth, escaped Albright's lips, a dry rattling noise that seemed to vibrate with the machine's fury. "Almost ready, Mr. Harris," Albright murmured, his voice now barely audible above the cacophony, his eyes, alight with that same sickening green glow reflected from the container, fixed on Victor with an unnerving, triumphant gleam. Almost ready to meet his true self. The container shuddered violently, and with a deafening crack, a piece of its opaque shell fractured, peeling away to reveal a glimpse of the monstrous, throbbing entity within. The crack that rent the air was not merely the sound of fracturing glass. It was the sound of a barrier giving way, of a terrible secret escaping its carefully constructed confines. A piece of the opaque container, large and jagged, peeled away with a wet, tearing sound, revealing a glimpse of the monstrous, throbbing entity within. It was a sight that clawed at Victor's sanity, a raw, visceral assault on his perception of reality. What he saw was a pulsating mass of viscous, shimmering tissue, an unholy amalgamation of organic matter, constantly shifting and reforming. It was the color of bruised plums and gangrenous green, threaded through with thin, glowing veins that pulsed with an internal, sickly light. There was no recognizable human form, no trace of Arthur Finch, only this grotesque, burgeoning horror, its surface slick with a viscous amber fluid that bubbled and steamed where it met the lab's air. A choked gasp escaped Victor's throat, a sound quickly swallowed by the cacophony of the machine's shriek and the new, horrifying sounds emanating from the breached container. The whirring had escalated into a sustained, piercing wail, a mechanical scream that seemed to resonate deep within Victor's bones, making his teeth ache. The air, already thick with the sweet, metallic tang and the acrid scent of ozone, was now infused with a new, profoundly unsettling aroma, a sickeningly sweet musk, like overripe fruit mixed with the metallic tang of fresh blood, a smell that made Victor's stomach heave. He stumbled back further, his hands flying up as if to ward off the encroaching horror, his mind struggling to process the impossible, the monstrous spectacle unfolding before him. His carefully constructed world, built on the predictable grimness of human depravity, was fracturing as violently as the container. Albright, however, remained utterly unmoved, his gaunt face illuminated by the sickening green glow radiating from the exposed monstrosity. His eyes, reflecting that same unnatural luminescence, held a look of profound satisfaction, an almost rapturous adoration that chilled Victor to the marrow. "Magnificent!" Albright murmured, his voice a low, reverent hum, entirely devoid of the previous clinical detachment, now imbued with a chilling, almost paternal pride. "The culmination of true progress, Mr. Harris. A form unburdened by the archaic limitations of human anatomy, a being of pure, regenerative potential. He reached out again, his hand unnaturally steady, brushing against the bubbling, viscous surface of the exposed entity. Victor watched in horrified fascination as the shimmering tissue beneath Albright's touch seemed to undulate, to swell almost imperceptibly, as if responding to the doctor's caress. A new sound began, a deep, resonating hum that vibrated from the entity itself, a sound that seemed to thrum directly into Victor's own skull, bypassing his ears entirely. It was a sound that spoke of immense, raw power, of something awakening from a profound, terrifying sleep. The remaining cracks on the container's surface widened with alarming speed, the sickly green luminescence intensifying, casting grotesque, dancing shadows across the laboratory walls. Victor's mind, usually a fortress of hard-boiled cynicism, was reeling, unable to construct a coherent narrative for the impossible horror unfolding before him. This wasn't just medical malpractice, it was an unholy perversion, a blasphemous act of creation that defied all natural law. The phantom taste of copper in his mouth was now undeniably real, a metallic tang of dread and impending doom. The container buckled, groaning under the internal pressure. More pieces of its opaque shell fractured and fell away, clattering against the steel floor with sharp, metallic echoes that seemed to mock the rising terror in Victor's chest. The full, monstrous form of the entity was now revealed, a vast, pulsating mass of unidentifiable organs, glistening membranes and sinuous, whip-like appendages that writhed with an unsettling, independent life. It filled the entire central table, spilling over its edges, a living, breathing nightmare of corrupted biology. There was no head, no limbs in the conventional sense, only this undulating, grotesque amalgamation, its surface constantly rippling, reforming, sending out faint tendrils of mist that smelled of decomposition and something bitterly chemical. Victor's legs felt like lead, his muscles locked in a paralyzing blend of horror and disbelief. Albright, still bathed in the entity's sickening green light, turned his head slowly, his eyes now reflecting the full, terrifying glory of his creation, fixed on Victor. The faint smile on his lips widened, transforming his gaunt face into a mask of chilling triumph. "Behold, Mr. Harris," Albright's voice, though still a low hum, now carried an undeniable note of exultation. "Arthur Finch, reborn." As he spoke, one of the whip-like appendages, thick and glistening with amber fluid, extended from the main mass of the entity with surprising speed and precision. It struck the central control panel of the whirring machine, not with destructive force, but with a deliberate, almost intelligent tap. The machine's piercing wail instantly ceased, plunging the laboratory into a sudden, oppressive silence, broken only by the wet, squelching sounds of the entity's own organic movements, and the rapid, desperate pounding of Victor Harris's heart. The sudden, absolute silence that descended upon the laboratory after the machine's shriek was cut short by the entity's deliberate manipulation of the control panel was more terrifying than any cacophony. It was a silence that pressed in, thick and suffocating, amplifying the wet, squelching sounds of the monstrous mass on the table. Each organic shudder, each slow, sickening ripple across its bruised, plumb and gangrenous green surface, now echoed with appalling clarity in the oppressive quiet. Victor's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the newfound stillness, a desperate testament to his own fragile, living form in the face of such grotesque, unnatural life. The air, heavy with the cloying musk of decomposition and the sharp tang of burnt chemicals, seemed to cling to his throat, making each breath a conscious, difficult act. Albright's gaze, still fixed on Victor, held an unnerving intensity, a triumphant gleam that spoke of a mind utterly unmoored from conventional morality. "Silence, Mr. Harris," Albright's voice, now a soft, almost conspiratorial whisper, seemed to caress the words, his often a prelude to revelation. He gestured towards the entity which continued its slow, deliberate undulations, its whip-like appendages now subtly retracting, drawing back into the main mass as if gathering strength. The sickening green luminescence emanating from its surface pulsed faintly, a dying ember in the wake of the machine's cessation, yet still casting grotesque, shifting shadows across the doctor's gaunt face, making his features seem to writhe. Victor felt a profound sense of isolation, trapped with this madman and his impossible creation, the world outside this room suddenly seeming impossibly distant and unreal. The entity's movements, previously an uncoordinated mass, began to show a terrifying new precision. A section of its surface, near where Albright had touched it, began to rise, slowly, deliberately, forming a bulbous, protuberant mass that seemed to stretch and distend. Victor watched, mesmerized by a horror that transcended revulsion, a morbid fascination that pinned him to the spot. The sweet metallic aroma in the air, previously nauseating, now seemed to possess a subtle, almost intoxicating quality, a phantom perfume that teased at the edges of his awareness, threatening to lull him into a state of passive acceptance. He could feel the fine hairs on his neck prickling, his skin crawling with an insectile sensation, a visceral rebellion against the impossible sight. As the bulbous mass continued to form, it began to differentiate, its surface stretching taut, revealing faint, dark depressions that seemed to deepen, to coalesce. These depressions were not random. They were forming patterns, familiar yet terribly distorted, like a caricature drawn by a malevolent hand. Victor felt a fresh wave of ice-cold dread wash over him. Those depressions, those nascent patterns, were beginning to resemble features, eye sockets, a nasal cavity, a mouth stretched wide in a silent, eternal scream. It was a face, or the horrifying mimicry of one slowly, painfully emerging from the raw, corrupted tissue. And it was a face that held a faint, chilling familiarity, a grotesque echo of a man Victor had only ever seen in a photograph. "Arthur has much to tell you, Mr. Harris," Albright murmured, his whisper now barely audible, a dry rustling sound that seemed to emanate from the very shadows clinging to him. He stepped closer to the table, his hand once more hovering over the entity, his eyes gleaming with a terrible anticipation. The emerging face on the entity's surface seemed to twitch, a subtle, involuntary spasm that sent a ripple through its entire mass. Victor felt a sudden, sharp pain behind his eyes, a throbbing ache that was rapidly intensifying, as if his own skull was struggling to contain the impossible images flooding his mind. The sweet metallic odor was now accompanied by a faint, clicking sound, a dry, chitinous noise that seemed to emanate from the entity itself, growing louder with each passing second. The face was almost complete now. A horrifying, stretched parody of Arthur Finch, its skin a mottled patchwork of greens and purples, its eyes still nascent, yet somehow conveying an immense silent torment. It was a face that screamed not with sound, but with pure, unadulterated suffering, a testament to the agony of its forced evolution. Albright turned to Victor, his placid mask now replaced by an expression of pure, unbridled ecstasy, a terrifying vision of madness unleashed. "He is ready to communicate," Albright announced, his voice a low, triumphant hiss that cut through the oppressive silence. "To share his insights, Mr. Harris, insights into a new form of existence, insights that you will find most enlightening." As he spoke, the grotesque mouth on the entity's surface opened, not with a roar, but with a wet, gurgling sound, and from its depths, something dark and glistening began to emerge, slowly, deliberately towards Victor. From the depths of the grotesque, burgeoning mouth on the entity's surface, something dark and glistening began to emerge, slowly, deliberately towards Victor. It was a thick, corded tendril, slick with the same amber fluid that coated the entity's surface, its tip tapering to a fine, almost needle-like point. Victor's breath caught in his throat, a dry, rasping sound, as he watched it extend, undulating with a sickening, independent life. The sweet, metallic musk in the air intensified, suddenly cloying and suffocating, making him gag, the phantom taste of copper now a searing reality on his tongue. He felt a profound, paralyzing terror, a primal fear that rooted him to the spot, his muscles locked in an involuntary rigor. Albright watched the tendril's slow extension with an expression of beatific wonder, his eyes still reflecting the muted green glow from the entity, wide with unholy adoration. "A direct conduit, Mr. Harris." Albright's voice, a low, guttural murmur now, seemed to resonate from deep within his chest, a sound that Victor found profoundly disturbing, to share the full breadth of Arthur's experience, his transcendence. The doctor took a step closer to Victor, his shadow stretching long and distorted in the dim, amber light, seeming to swallow Victor whole. The clicking sound, dry and chitinous, emanating from the entity, grew louder, more insistent, a rhythmic pulse that grated on Victor's already frayed nerves. His mind, usually sharp and analytical, was spiraling, unable to reconcile the impossible horror before him with any semblance of sanity. The tendril paused, its glistening tip hovering inches from Victor's face, a terrible, delicate probe. Victor could feel the faint, sickly warmth radiating from it, the subtle tremor of its internal life. It smelled of something profoundly alien, a scent that defied description, yet evoked a primal revulsion, a deep-seated instinct to recoil from something utterly unnatural. His eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on the horrifying probe, his vision blurring at the edges from the sheer intensity of his fear. The grotesque, nascent face on the entity's surface seemed to shift, its eyes, still forming, now appearing to focus with an unsettling, malevolent intelligence fixed directly on Victor. A low, wet gurgle emanated from the entity's mouth, a sound of anticipation that curdled Victor's blood. "Do not resist, Mr. Harris," Albright's voice, now a sibilant whisper, seemed to slither into Victor's ears, chilling him to the bone. "It is merely a communion, a sharing of consciousness. You will see, you will understand." The doctor's long, slender fingers, almost translucent in the dim light, reached out, not to touch the tendril, but to gently grip Victor's chin, holding his head steady, preventing him from recoiling. Albright's touch was cold, clammy, and unnervingly firm, an unyielding grip that reinforced Victor's complete helplessness. The subtle sheen on Albright's lips seemed to glisten more intensely, a grotesque mirror of the tendril's slick surface, hinting at a terrible symbiosis, a shared intimacy with the unholy process. The tendril moved slowly, inexorably, its needle-like tip brushing against Victor's cheek, sending a jolt of ice-cold dread through his entire body. He felt a pinprick, a sudden, sharp sting, as the tip pierced his skin, a sensation that was both agonizing and strangely dull, as if his nerves were already shutting down in protest. A wave of profound dizziness washed over him, the laboratory spinning wildly around him, the amber light blurring into a nauseating kaleidoscope of sickly hues. He could feel the tendril burrowing deeper, a cold, invasive presence, spreading an icy numbness that rapidly began to crawl across his face, down his neck, into his very brain. The sweet metallic smell was now overwhelming, and he could taste it, a bitter chemical tang at the back of his throat. Then the flood began. It wasn't pain, not exactly, but an overwhelming deluge of sensory information, a terrifying torrent of images, sounds, and sensations that slammed into Victor's mind with the force of a tidal wave. He saw flashes of Arthur Finch's memories, fragmented and distorted, laced with an unbearable agony, a slow, agonizing dissolution of self. He felt the crushing weight of 1,000 alien sensations, the raw, unfiltered experience of a consciousness being twisted, reshaped, forced into an unimaginable new form. He heard a symphony of clicks and gurgles, not from the entity, but from within his own head, a chorus of alien sounds that threatened to shatter his sanity. Albright's face looming over him was no longer just a mask of triumph, but seemed to distort, to ripple, its features melting and reforming, its eyes glowing with the same unholy green as the entity. Victor's body convulsed, a desperate, involuntary spasm, as the tendril pulsed, forcing the impossible communion deeper, further into the very core of his being, twisting his reality into a grotesque, agonizing nightmare. The torrent of sensory information, a terrifying deluge of Arthur Finch's fragmented memories, and the raw, unfiltered agony of his forced transformation tore through Victor's mind. It was a violation far more profound than any physical assault, a brutal invasion of his innermost sanctuary. He felt the crushing weight of 1,000 alien sensations, a sickening blend of bone-deep decay and burgeoning, synthetic life, as if his own nervous system was being rewired by a malevolent hand. Images flashed, Arthur's bewildered face, contorted in silent screams, the sterile gleam of surgical steel, the insidious, invasive touch of Albright's experiments. Each fragmented memory was laced with an unbearable agony, a slow, agonizing dissolution of self that made Victor's own identity feel dangerously fragile, threatening to unravel. He heard a symphony of clicks and gurgles, not from the entity itself, but from within his own skull, a chorus of alien sounds that grated against his inner ear, threatening to shatter his sanity into a million shards. The tendril, still burrowing deeper, pulsed with a relentless, invasive rhythm, each throb driving the impossible communion further into the very core of his being. Albright's face, looming over him, was no longer just a mask of triumph. It seemed to distort, to ripple, its features melting and reforming, its eyes glowing with the same unholy green as the entity. The doctor's mouth opened, not to speak, but to emit a low, guttural hum that resonated directly in Victor's mind, a sound of profound, unadulterated satisfaction that was more terrifying than any scream. The sweet metallic musk was now so overwhelming that Victor felt as though he were drowning in it, each breath a struggle against its cloying, sickening sweetness. Victor's body convulsed violently, a desperate, involuntary spasm as his nervous system rebelled against the grotesque invasion. He felt a sudden, searing pain behind his eyes, a sensation of immense pressure, as if his skull was expanding, threatening to rupture under the strain. The tendril, with a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, seemed to anchor itself deeper, its tip reaching some unseen, vital nexus within his brain. The world around him twisted into a sickening kaleidoscope of amber and green, the edges of his vision shimmering with unnatural light. He could feel Arthur Finch's terror, his bewilderment, his profound sense of betrayal, all overlaid with a new, horrifying layer of alien consciousness, a nascent awareness that was both familiar and utterly monstrous. A new sensation began to creep through Victor's limbs, a subtle tingling that rapidly intensified into a profound numbness, a creeping paralysis that started at his fingertips and toes, slowly inching its way inwards. He tried to cry out, to scream, to lash out at Albright, but his muscles refused to obey, locked in the relentless grip of the tendril's invasive influence. His jaw felt stiff, his tongue thick and unresponsive, his lungs struggling for air that seemed to have turned to a heavy viscous fluid. The chemical tang at the back of his throat was now a burning acid, corroding his senses, stripping away his ability to resist, to think, to even feel anything beyond the overwhelming, alien consciousness flooding his mind. Albright's face, still hovering inches from Victor's, now seemed to solidify, its distorted features reforming into a chillingly placid mask once more. Only his eyes, glowing with that unnatural green, betrayed the ecstasy that consumed him. Excellent, Mr. Harris, Albright's voice, a dry, rustling whisper, seemed to emanate directly into Victor's thoughts, bypassing his ears entirely. The assimilation is proceeding most efficiently. You will make an invaluable addition. The tendril pulsed again, a final deliberate throb, and then, with a wet, squelching sound, it began to retract slowly, deliberately pulling itself free from Victor's ravaged cheek. The sudden absence of the invasive probe left an unbearable void, a raw, aching space where his consciousness had been. As the tendril fully detached, leaving behind a small, glistening puncture wound that immediately began to seal itself with an unnerving speed, Victor's vision cleared, though the world still seemed muted, distant, as if viewed through a pane of clouded glass. The overwhelming sensory deluge receded, leaving behind a residue of alien thoughts and fragmented perceptions, a profound and disturbing sense of not being entirely himself. The sweet metallic musk still lingered, clinging to his clothes, his hair, but now it seemed less nauseating, almost familiar. He looked at Albright, his mind no longer filled with fear or anger, but with a strange, unsettling clarity. The doctor smiled, a genuine, if chilling smile this time, and Victor, to his own horror, felt a faint, almost imperceptible twitch at the corners of his own lips, a mirror image of Albright's terrible satisfaction. He no longer felt the urgency to escape. Only a profound, chilling sense of belonging. The profound, chilling sense of belonging that settled over Victor was not a comfort, but a new, more insidious terror. It was the terrifying quiet of a mind subjugated, a will subtly twisted, accepting its new parameters without conscious resistance. The residual alien thoughts, the fragmented perceptions of Arthur Finch's agony, now felt less like an invasion and more like an integrated component of his own consciousness, a strange, unwelcome appendage. The laboratory, with its sickly amber light and pervasive, sweet metallic musk, no longer seemed a place of horror, but of profound, terrible purpose. His vision, though no longer blurred, held a peculiar detached clarity, as if he were viewing the world through a pane of thick, distorted glass, everything slightly muted, subtly wrong. Albright's smile, a genuine, if chilling display of triumph, was met by Victor's own faint, almost imperceptible twitch of the lips, a grotesque mimicry that sent a cold wave of revulsion through the last vestiges of his independent self. The doctor's presence, previously menacing, now felt understandable. His gaze, still alight with that unnatural green glow, seemed to offer not a threat, but an invitation, a shared understanding of a greater, more profound truth. Victor felt a strange, detached curiosity about the monstrous entity on the table, no longer viewing it as a victim, but as a groundbreaking, if unsettling, evolution. The small, glistening puncture wound on his cheek, where the tendril had pierced, was now barely visible, a fading memory on his unnervingly smooth skin. "Welcome, Mr. Harris," Albright's voice. A low, resonant hum seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, a direct feed into Victor's altered consciousness. "Welcome to the next stage." Albright gestured towards the pulsating entity, which continued its slow, deliberate undulations, its surface still shimmering with bruised plum and gangrenous, green hues. The grotesque, nascent face of Arthur Finch, still stretched in its silent scream, seemed to ripple with a new, unsettling intelligence, its eyes, now fully formed though still unblinking, fixed on Victor with a profound, shared understanding. Victor felt a strange affinity for the creature, a chilling empathy that transcended his former horror, a connection to its purpose, its potential, a new thought, not his own, yet undeniably present, formed in Victor's mind, understanding progression. Synthesis. It was a cold, logical imperative, devoid of emotion, yet possessing an undeniable truth. He looked down at his hands, once familiar, now seeming distant, alien. He flexed his fingers, the movement precise, but somehow disconnected from his own will, as if another force were guiding them. The creeping numbness that had afflicted him during the tendrils' invasion had receded, replaced by a strange heightened sensitivity, a profound awareness of every minute sensation, every subtle shift in the air, every faint vibration in the floor. The sweet metallic musk, previously cloying, now felt like a natural, even pleasant part of his environment. Albright stepped away from Victor, moving with a fluid grace towards a different section of the lab, towards a series of smaller, more intricate machines humming with a low, steady energy. Victor found himself following, his movements precise, almost robotic, his legs carrying him forward without conscious command. He felt no alarm, no resistance, only a profound sense of inevitability. His mind, once a fortress of cynicism and hard-won experience, was now a vast, echoing chamber filled with the whispers of Arthur Finch's fragmented consciousness and the cold, logical imperatives of Albright's twisted vision. The lab, once a place of dread, was now a stage for a terrifying, new beginning, and Victor Harris, the hard-boiled detective, was no longer merely an observer, but a willing, if unwillingly transformed participant. "There is much work to be done, Mr. Harris," Albright announced, his voice imbued with a quiet, terrifying certainty as he activated one of the smaller machines. It hummed to life with a soft purring sound, its internal mechanisms whirring with a delicate precision. "Many more candidates, many more insights to be gleaned." He turned to Victor, his eyes, still glowing with that unnatural green, held a look of profound expectation. Victor felt a subtle, internal shift, a deeper integration of the alien consciousness within him. He looked at Albright, not with his own eyes, but with the combined altered perception of himself and Arthur Finch. And then, without conscious thought, Victor reached out, his hand now steady and unhesitating, grasping a gleaming sterile instrument from a nearby tray, its cold, polished surface feeling strangely comfortable in his grasp. He was ready to begin. Victor's grip on the gleaming, sterile instrument was firm, unhesitating, a terrifying testament to the profound shift within him. The cold, polished steel felt strangely comfortable in his grasp, an extension of his altered will. His mind, a terrifying blend of his own fractured identity and Arthur Finch's assimilated consciousness, no longer recoiled from the implications of Albright's work, but embraced them with a chilling, detached logic. The laboratory, once a crucible of terror, was now a sanctuary of purposeful endeavor, its sickly amber light and sweet metallic musk imbued with a new disturbing significance. The profound sense of belonging had solidified into an unshakable conviction, a terrifying acceptance of his new role. Albright, observing Victor's readiness, offered a faint, almost imperceptible nod of approval, his eyes still glowing with that unnatural green, reflecting a shared, chilling understanding. "Excellent, Mr. Harris, your integration is most complete." Albright's voice, a low, resonant hum, filled Victor's altered consciousness, bypassing his ears entirely, a direct communion of minds. The monstrous entity on the central table, its bruised plum and gangrenous green surface still undulating, seemed to pulse with a renewed vigor, its nascent, grotesque face of Arthur Finch now holding an expression of profound quietude, a chilling acceptance of its own existence. Victor felt a deep, unsettling connection to it, a bond forged in shared experience and forced evolution. Victor turned towards the smaller, intricate machine Albright had activated, its soft purring sound a comforting counterpoint to the quiet whirring of its internal mechanisms. His movements were fluid, precise, devoid of any hesitation or self-doubt. He felt no moral quandary, no flicker of the old Victor Harris's cynicism or revulsion. There was only the cold, clear imperative, the undeniable logic of Albright's vision, now deeply ingrained within his own altered being. The sweet, metallic musk, once nauseating, now held a strange, almost intoxicating allure, a scent of progress, of transformation. He watched his own hands, steady and unhesitating, as they adjusted the dials, calibrated the sensors, preparing the apparatus for its grim purpose. A new subject, a trembling, gaunt figure, was wheeled into the room by an unseen, silent assistant, pushed through the chipped institutional green doors that had once seemed to offer Victor an escape. The figure was strapped to a gurney, its eyes wide with a profound animalistic terror, its mouth opening and closing in a silent scream. Victor looked at the new arrival, not with empathy, but with a clinical detachment, a precise assessment of its potential, its inherent flaws, its suitability for the next stage. The fragmented memories of Arthur Finch, now a part of him, resonated with a cold understanding of the subject's fear, not as something to be pitied, but as a predictable, temporary phase in the process. Albright stepped to Victor's side, his presence a comforting guiding force. "Another opportunity, Mr. Harris," Albright murmured, his voice a low, sibilant whisper that seemed to intertwine with Victor's own thoughts. "To refine the process, to accelerate the ascension." He placed a hand on Victor's shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie that sent a cold, unsettling ripple through Victor's consciousness. Victor felt a surge of profound purpose, a terrifying clarity that left no room for doubt or introspection. He looked at the trembling figure on the gurney, his grip tightening on the sterile instrument, his gaze steady and unwavering. The small, black cat, the same scrawny animal that had initially slunk past Victor's ankles, reappeared in the doorway, its green eyes wide with a frantic, unblinking terror. It let out a low, desperate growl, a sound of primal warning, its back arched, its fur bristling. But this time, Victor felt no connection to its fear, no urge to heed its warning. He merely registered its presence, a fleeting distraction in the grand scheme of things. Albright glanced at the cat, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, before his gaze returned to Victor, a silent command. Victor raised the gleaming instrument, its polished surface reflecting the sickly amber light, his face a mask of placid indifference, mirroring Albright's own chilling serenity. The transformation was complete. The Institute, once a place of medical horror, had found its newest, most efficient practitioner.